Hi everyone, welcome to the Pastor on the Porch. I'm Stuart Milton, and I'm here with Snarky Singing Amy.
That is me.
And I love calling you that.
Yes, you do.
And it probably beats some of the other things that you've been called.
I've been called to.
And I have been called some pretty crazy things as well, but we're not going to go into that.
We're going to think about the good ones.
Yeah. Well, we're in part 3 of our quick look at some of the highlights of Mark's Gospel. We have noted that one of the symbols for Mark's Gospel is the winged lion. Hope that you'll check out last week's video for more information on that. But the discussion about lions reminded me of one of my favorite books of all time, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is a children's book, but it has a lot of great Christian symbolism, and I would encourage you to read it again if it's been a while. In the book, Jesus is represented by a lion by the name of Aslan. There are 4 children, and they are introduced to Aslan the lion by Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And Mr. Beaver says to them, "Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him." One of the children, Susan, asks, "But shall we see him?" "Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I'm to lead you to where you shall meet him," says Mr. Beaver. "Well, is he a man?" asked Lucy, the youngest. "Aslan, a man?" said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Ooh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." Well, I love that dialogue. Especially I like the phrase, "At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more." I think it's something we need to be reminded of. When we see Jesus, our sorrows will cease. And then there's that question, is he safe? And no, following Jesus isn't safe. Some have claimed that once a person decides to follow Jesus, all will be well. Yeah, not always.
Sorry.
Well, that's true. Not always. Those who have followed Jesus for a short time or for a long time know that it isn't true. In this world, you will have trouble, Jesus said. No, following Jesus isn't always safe. But it wasn't always safe for Jesus himself as he was tortured, beaten, crucified, and died. No, following Jesus is not always safe either. We know that Jesus is good, though, and that is all that matters. For Jesus is good, and we can trust him. Well, let's move to the readings in Mark. Our readings take us to Holy Week. I hope you will read Mark 11 through 16. And we will read of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and his continued feuds with the religious leaders. There are a lot of familiar stories and some challenging ones as well. Spend some time with them. In the middle of this week's readings, we will discover the little apocalypse. It's chapter 13. It speaks of his second coming. We continue the theme that following Jesus isn't always safe. Listen to these words of Jesus. "And you will hear of wars and threats of war, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, as well as famines. But this is only the first of the birth pains. with more to come. When these things begin to happen, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. For the good news must first be preached to all nations. That was Mark 13, verses 7 through 10. I don't have any idea when Jesus will return. I have been asked many times, and the answer is always the same. Only the Father knows. You see, every generation can and does look at the things going on in the world and believes that His coming is near. Wars and rumors of war come in every generation. Natural disasters like the one in Turkey recently, as well as weather events which have caused famine and hunger all over the world, do happen in every generation. Jesus' followers are beaten and tortured for their faith. Others are simply falsely accused of being unbelievers. Jesus says all that will happen before He returns. You know, the truth is that doesn't sound safe. But through it all, we know that Jesus is good, and trusting Him is necessary. In that same chapter, Jesus simply reminds us that we must keep watch and hold on to Him. Hold on to His goodness, and that will be enough. In this week's readings, we also read about the three most important days in human history. It began on what we know of as Maundy, or Holy Thursday, where Jesus shared a Last Supper with His friends. I brought with me a representation of what the scene may have looked like. More on that next month, but notice that the people would have been reclining, not sitting in chairs. They were reclining on three sides. Remember that Jesus said to eat and drink in remembrance. Again, I'll pay a little bit more closer attention to that next month. An interesting part of Mark's story comes following the arrest of Jesus. In chapter 14, verses 51 and 52, we see a young man at the arrest of Jesus who runs away naked. Many scholars guess that this was actually Mark as a young man. Now, it doesn't say so in the text, of course. We will never know for certain.
Mark said, not me.
Okay, we're going to have to start over because you messed me up.
You know, me too. It just was so funny.
Of course, it doesn't say that in the text, and perhaps we will never know for certain. But that is a detail that few would have ever noticed, and so people do believe it was Mark. It is possible that Mark saw the arrest and was changed. Well, on Good or Black Friday, Jesus is tried by the religious and political rulers and is sentenced to hang on a cross. He suffered. He died for your sin and for mine. Of course, the story of the resurrection is always a reminder that Jesus is good, and while following Him may not always be easy, He overcomes all. The women go to the tomb. They see an angel who tells them that He has risen and that He is going ahead of them into Galilee. The angel says to the women, "Go, share the good news with His disciples and Peter." By saying this, there is the reminder to all of us that even if we have denied knowing Jesus, there is hope, there is restoration, there is forgiveness. Now, Mark's resurrection story is a little bit different. The most reliable manuscripts abruptly end with verse 8, with the women terrified and fleeing the tomb. Yet most of our Bibles also contain a second resurrection story. Most scholars believe, though, that verse 9 and following are a much later addition. And I'm kind of glad because it is kind of strange. It tells us to go out and handle snakes. No, thank you. I prefer, though, to be reminded that the resurrected Jesus is constantly going ahead of us, always going ahead of me and you. Jesus is risen. Jesus is risen from the dead because the tomb is empty. And that is enough. Even in the unsafe and terrifying times of life, it is proof that Jesus is good. Jesus is risen, and that is enough. Hallelujah. I'll see you next week as we begin the story of Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke.